Paul is arguably the most controversial figure in the New Testament, and he's also the person who's most frequently attacked by skeptics. He wrote about a quarter of the New Testament. He appears as the main character in about half of the book of Acts, but skeptics often claim that he was in dispute with the other apostles, and that in any case, much of the writing attributed to him is of later origin. And in this video, we're going to look at some of the evidence that shows that the letters of Paul are authentic and that Paul was a real apostle working with the other apostles to deliver the gospel of Jesus Christ. So subscribe to the channel, hit the notify, give us a like and share the video if you can. Let's start. So first of all, let's think about how we know about Paul. First of all, we have Paul's own letters. There are 13 letters in the New Testament, which start off with something that tells us that Paul wrote them. In the Acts of the Apostles, Paul is one of the main figures. About half of Acts is about the Apostle Paul. That's written by someone who traveled with the Apostle Paul. He saw what Paul did part of the time, and he was able to talk to Paul and find out what Paul did for other parts of Paul's career. And the third source, which is of less use than the other two, but still of some use, is the Apostolic Fathers. These were people who lived the generation after the apostles, but as young men, they met the apostles who were by this stage elderly people. And they wrote a bit about what the apostles had been doing at the end of the first century and the beginning of the second century. So they were alive in the apostolic period. They knew what was going on. So let's start off by thinking about the letters of Paul. First question is, are they reliable? Well, Paul wrote them. Well, perhaps we should say he dictated them. Very often he uses a secretary, but nonetheless, these are Paul's words written down for him by a professional scribe and then sent out to other places. The letters, they have recipients. And he actually is very careful to make sure that people know these are real letters from Paul. He signs off in his own handwriting at the end, which people recognize. There's an example in 2 Thessalonians. He writes off that he is greeting them with his own handwriting, and that way everyone who sees one of his letters can know that it is Paul who is writing and not somebody else who's pretending to be Paul. Altogether, there are 13 letters. 7 of these are absolutely considered to be by Paul. Nobody has disputed that these letters are Pauline. There are, of course, another 6 letters which some skeptics dispute. The more skeptical they are, the more of those they dispute. I'm going to tell you that those are genuine letters. They're actually authentic letters. Nevertheless, it's only a question of who disputes them, not as to whether they're trustworthy. How do we know? Well, we've got evidence, of course, and here's some of it. This is a small chunk in Paul's letter to the Romans, and it refers to this gentleman, Erastus, who is the city treasurer in Corinth, where Romans was written from. And we know Erastus existed because he paid for a pavement to be laid, and he left his name on it. It's a sort of election poster. When people walked across the pavement, they would read that, and it says, Erastus, for having been made aedile. Aedile was a magistrate in the government of a Roman colony or in Rome itself. And then he puts SP stravit, laid this SP suo pecuniam with his own money. So Erastus has paid for the pavement to be laid. He's done that because he's been made aedile, which is an earlier part of the career of someone who is going through advancement in the structure of a Roman city. And later on, he becomes treasurer, and that's when Romans is written. So we have confirmation of people, of places, of things going on. And we know that Paul's letters are, in fact, authentic. Another one, undesigned coincidences and undesigned coincidence happens when you get insignificant details in different places, which provide a constant picture, one which is unrelated to the main point of the document, something that would easily be lost if the document was badly copied, or if it was being written as a fiction, or if fictional details were in there, or if it was just unreliably transmitted. So here's an example. In 2 Timothy, Paul writes to Timothy that he is to ignore the mistakes made by young people. So we can deduce from that Timothy was a young man. And it comes up again in 1 Timothy chapter 4. He says, don't let anyone despise you for your youth. So there are 2 letters, both of which refer to the fact that Timothy is a young man. According to the skeptics, those 2 letters are written by different people. So there's just a little detail that's been picked up in both of them. If you compare those with the letter to Titus, which is written shortly after the letter to Timothy and is very similar to it, it doesn't mention youth for Titus. Titus is not a young man, and so Paul doesn't mention youth because he hasn't got one. So we've got details that show us that these letters are authentic, and there are not just 1 or 2, there are many, many of these undesigned coincidences in the letters of Paul and between Paul and the Acts of the Apostles. Here's another one. Let's give you another one in a moment. This one is about Acts. So Acts is written by a companion of Paul. We know that Luke, who wrote the Acts of the Apostles, is a companion of Paul, because when he writes some of the narrative, he includes himself in it. So here we've got himself talking about him and Paul. We sailed away from Philippi. We came to Troas. We stayed there 7 days. We were gathered together to break bread, and it's the upper room where we were gathered. So this is someone who is traveling with the Apostle Paul. In bits ways, not traveling with the Apostle Paul. He did. So we can see that this little detail identifies a companion of Paul, and that's what Luke was. And well, pretty well every chapter in Acts contains facts that can be checked. It's got accounts of cities, of rivers, sea voyages, people. When you look at the places, archaeology wise or geographically, you find that there are no mistakes there. If you look at the sea voyages, you can look at the currents and the winds. You can see they take the right amount of time, go from the right place to the right place, and in general are completely the way things fit. And that's a picture of Corinth. That's the Lechaeum road. Behind us is the port of Lechaeum. Corinth had 2 ports, and these steps here at the bottom of it, we've got they found the lintel of the synagogue. So it must have been somewhere near those stairs, and Paul refers to that in his letters, and it's referred to in Acts. And there are other bits of the city which we've dug up that are referred to in the accounts in Acts. Not just city details, not just the geography, it happens for the people as well. Good example is the set of governors that we have. The governors in different towns had different titles. The Roman Empire only sent a small number of people out to be governors. They tended to use the structures that had been used before the places were conquered by the Romans, and they all had different ways of governing themselves. So, for example, in Paphos, we have a proconsul, as a Roman official sent out in order to govern the province. And it's a senatorial province, so it's a proconsul, and we have the same thing in Corinth. But Caesarea is the capital of a smaller province, and the person in charge there is a procurator. In Philippi, the name of the people in charge of the town are strategoi, generals, and they are assisted by people called rhabdouchoi, rod carriers. That would be the equivalent of a Roman lictor, an official who was there to boost the status of the man in charge. Interesting, the spelling in Thessalonica, they have polytarches. Most cities had polyarches. not Polytarches, but Thessalonica was different. And people said, oh, Luke spelt it wrong, but there's an inscription which they dug up. It's in the British Museum at the moment, which shows the correct spelling is the one used by Luke for that city. Different cities, different spellings. In Ephesus, the man in charge is the grammateus, the town clerk, and so it goes on. Luke gets it right every time. Not only that, it's a moving target. So in Achaia, we know about the person in charge there. He's a proconsul on Paul's second missionary journey when he arrives in Corinth, but he was replaced by a propraetor. Instead, the province changed its status. We know about this particular procurator rather well. We've got an inscription. This inscription is in Delphi. It's in a museum there. And if you look at this part of it over here, got it expanded, you can see there is the name of Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia at the time when Paul comes. And he was the brother of Seneca, famous Roman writer. So we know about him from that end. And this inscription, while it's only fragmentary, has enough information on it to be dated fairly precisely. The particular part of the reign of Claudius down to well under a year when that particular inscription was made. And Gallio was governor at that point. We know that he was only governor for a short period of time, that he went home before his term was finished, pleading illness. And so we can date that exactly, and we know who the governor of Achaia was and that the date in which he was the governor, and it's exactly the date that we get from the Acts of the Apostles. It's one of the useful fixed points for getting dates right at that time. Undesigned coincidences is an interesting one. We've got Timothy, again writing to Timothy, and he says of Timothy that you know the persecutions that Paul suffered from in Antioch, in Iconium, and in Lystra. Why would he know that? Well, there's various correspondences with Acts. First thing is that in the Acts of the Apostles, on Paul's first missionary journey, he goes to Galatia, and he visits the cities Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and a fourth one, Derbe. And this letter lists them in the same order that Paul visited them in Acts. Now, what else do we know about it? Well, Paul was persecuted in 3 of those cities, Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra, but he wasn't persecuted in Derbe. And the third thing is that Timothy knows about Paul's persecutions. How does he know? Well, if we look in Acts, we can see where Timothy came from. And the next journey, Paul goes back and he travels to Derbe and to Lystra. And in Lystra, he picks up Timothy, and Timothy comes with him on his journey. And so Timothy knows, because he comes from Lystra, so he knows about the persecutions that Paul had in Lystra and the other 2 cities where Paul was persecuted before he came to Lystra. We know another thing about Timothy here. His mother was Jewish. That meant he went to the school and the synagogue, and he became familiar with the scriptures, and that's picked up into Timothy as well. So we have this little tiny detail about Timothy, that he knew the Old Testament. How did he know it? Well, he knew it because his mother was Jewish, and he would have access to the scriptures in the synagogue. So we have this whole number of small details which go together and show a picture about Timothy, which isn't ever written up, but it's there and found just in the tiny details. And by putting together these details, we can actually work out dates for the various different letters in the New Testament, but in particular the letters of Paul. So here's an example looking at Galatians, and it talks about a visit that they made to Jerusalem. He's saying he only made 2 visits after his conversion by the time Galatians was written. And the second visit is this one here in Acts. It's a visit in order to take relief to the Christians in Jerusalem because they were suffering from a famine. And we know when that famine was, because we can see how the grain prices changed, and we've got enough evidence to know about that. So Galatians must be written before Paul's third visit to Jerusalem. We know about that. That happened in 48 AD. So look at a time chart, how it puts together. We've got these dates from the Acts of the Apostles and from Archaeology. And we can say, well, Paul was converted 14 years before the famine relief visit. Remember how they counted in the old days? They will count the first year and the last year, both being part of the interval. So 14 years earlier, in 33 AD, Paul is converted to Christianity, meets Jesus and is converted. 3 years later, he goes and visits Jerusalem. And then his second visit is the famine relief visit. So Galatians is written after that. It's only visited Jerusalem twice. Now, the third visit is for a council in Jerusalem, and that's in 48 AD. And Galatians is written before that visit. He says he's only visited Jerusalem twice since his conversion. In any case, it covers things that would have been fixed at the Council of Jerusalem, and he would have mentioned that. It would be very important. He would have mentioned that in the letter had it already happened. So Galatians must be written between the famine relief visit and the Council of Jerusalem, but we can do better than that, because in the year in between is the year when Paul goes on his missionary journey to Galatia, and he founds the congregations that he refers to in Galatians. So it must have been written between him returning from the first missionary journey and him setting off for the Council of Jerusalem. Now, he can't travel in the winter, or he couldn't then. Too much in the way of snow melt, and the seas were too rough, or the sky was too cloudy, so they couldn't navigate. And so it must have been written either immediately Paul returned, which seems unlikely, or just before Paul sets off for the Council of Jerusalem, when he's heard about problems in Galatia. So we can fix Galatians to the very earliest part. As soon as it's safe to travel again, Paul writes his letter to Galatia and then sets off for the Council of Jerusalem. And we have a date for Galatians. That makes it the first book to be written in the New Testament. And we can do that for all the letters. Similar arguments, often very detailed, based on little tiny details in the text. And we can put together all the letters of Paul and the Acts of the Apostles, and we can show when they come, and we can get them often to within a month or two. So 1 Corinthians is written in 55 AD, and it's written between Passover and Pentecost. Romans is written fairly early on in the spring of 56 AD, just before Paul leaves Corinth. And so it goes on. Now, that's a kind of undesigned coincidence on its own. They fit so exactly into the account based on very tiny details, which would easily be lost if there was bad memory in terms of Acts, or if the letters had been made up. So they all fit together, and we have this huge amount of evidence that tells us that the Acts of the Apostles is accurate and that the letters of Paul are authentic. Do you find this evidence convincing? Let us know right in the comments section that go with this video. So why would we trust Paul? Okay, we know we've got authentic letters. Is he at odds with all the other apostles? He's writing out something that's new. Well, he's accepted by the other apostles. Here's a quotation from the second letter of Peter, another of the apostles, and he talks about Paul as our beloved brother Paul. Peter and Paul are not enemies to one another. And he talks about the letters of Paul, and says some people misinterpreting these letters as they do the other scriptures. So Peter considers the letters written by the Apostle Paul to be scripture in their own right. Paul is accepted by the other apostles. There isn't any kind of difference between them. And the teaching of the other apostles and the teaching of Paul is in fact the same anyhow. So in 1 Corinthians, he's talking about the teaching of the resurrection, and he talks about the other apostles working with him. He's the least of the apostles because he works harder than any of the other apostles, he says. And it doesn't matter whether it's them or whether it's Paul. We preach the same thing, he says. And they believed it, the people who live in Corinth. So Paul teaches what the other apostles teach. And Later writers, the Apostolic Fathers, tell us that Paul worked with the other apostles. Clement, for example, refers to Peter and Paul working together and proclaiming the same gospel as one another. And that's in the whole of chapter 5 of 1 Clement, letter Clement wrote in about 96 AD. And there are other references in people writing a decade or so later on. Clement knew the apostles, and he says they worked together. And the idea that they were at odds with one another, it's one of these phoenix theories, it gets shot down in ashes, but somehow it seems to be made to fly by skeptics. So, given all this, we wouldn't reject Paul, would we? If you think you've got a reason why we would still reject Paul, write it in the comments and let's have a look at it. But the point here is that the teaching that Paul gives is exactly the same as the writing in the other writings of the apostles. And we've got the Gospels, we've got other letters, and they all tell the same story. It's one of the interesting things about the Bible is just how consistent it actually is. It's important. Paul says the same as the other apostles, but we get extra detail from Paul. There's a little bit more writing, so there's a little bit more detail. And he describes himself as an apostle called by Jesus Christ. This is the first verse to be written of the New Testament. It's in Galatians chapter 1, verse 1. It's the first verse, and he talks about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There it is, the first verse that Paul writes in his first letter. And we've got an eyewitness of events in the New Testament. In Paul, we've got his own letters that tell us all about what's been going on. And last of all, he's an eyewitness to the resurrection of Jesus. So Paul tells us that Jesus was raised from the dead, and he is someone who met Jesus alive after his resurrection. And he writes with his own hand, we have his own words saying what happens. So Paul is an important character, someone you can't ignore. Have a look at the comments below, have a look at the links, join up and subscribe. And if you like, go to our website and see what else we have to tell you.